The date is Wednesday, the 27th of August, 2025, and this morning, many of us discovered that a school shooting took place in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the school that was targeted, and at this point in time, all evidence points to the attack being deliberate, intentional, and directed at that specific location. The school that was attacked was a Catholic school. And as of right now, the death toll and the injury toll is that there are 2 dead, ages 8 and 10, and 17 injured, including elderly. And this school shooting, or this outburst of violence, fits a pattern that we have started to see both in the identity and the ideology of the shooter, as well as in, well, almost predictable responses that are going to follow. And this episode, this presentation is directed specifically at churches, at religious leaders, and those who are the men of the church who are now looking at yet another evidence, another example of attacks against their youth, their children, that are asking themselves what they do, and it's also a warning on what not to do and how to be careful. Now, my background is not intended to be an authoritative statement, but for context, I have studied both theology on an academic level, and as well as had about a 15-year career and experience in different positions that involve violence or the potentiality of violence, including special operations and otherwise. But that, again, is not an intent to give my opinion undue authority, especially at the time that we are at right now, where many of those who have built their public personas on their military valor and achievements are really being shown to be nothing short of liars. It's not my desire to be honored for something that I've done and enjoyed doing in many cases, but rather that this is a tragic example where some expertise might come into play. And in the realm that we're looking at, specifically with the combination of defense and security activities, as well as the dynamics of a church and the lack of men present, this is an address specifically to Western churches. The objective of this message is to begin with what we understand this murderer did and how it follows a pattern, and followed by what we ought expect to come from the media. From there, I want to illustrate what I believe to be the ideal form of a church security team and what it would look like in a practical sense, as well as adding a little bit of the intellectual, making sure that we are able to distinguish between tactical and strategic goals. Moving in, and then moving away from the technical, we will also be addressing some accusations you might expect if your church decides to consider what its security apparatus looks like. Finally, as there are 2 concluding pieces that could not be separated, and one of them is a theological argument why you ought, or why a church ought protect its congregation, and why some consideration towards its security is not a frivolous element of the day, but rather a moral imperative and an obligation of leadership. And then finally, methods that we can use, if you stick to the end, methods that you can take home for identifying certain types of activity and probes, particularly in this case, a probe against your church. One tool for your toolbox, so to speak. I know that's kind of a cringy way of saying it, but I want to leave you with something that your team will want to consider, and something that they can do in a situation like this that's supported by the above information, the context of what we've seen as patterns, the theological argument, which does say that we have an obligation to do such, and then what to expect as far as pushback. And although this topic is sensitive and it can be, in some ways, for some people actually now, a sense of fear or urgency developed from that, this episode is sponsored by Obsidian Arms, and Obsidian Arms is also, is also from Minnesota, and they are a manufacturer of tools and equipment that pertain to this type of lifestyle, even though that language is that's my use of it. You can tell that these reads, my support of or support by Obsidian Arms, I hope, is organic. I'm not reading off of a script. But Obsidian Arms sells a series of punch and tool kits as well as other equipment involving the maintenance and the performance of tools that would be involved in a security environment. And so if you were looking to become more self-sufficient, whether as a professional gunsmith or as somebody who just simply wants to have the tools at hand to maintain your equipment without worry or reducing the chance of losing parts or breaking them, head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. They're 100% American made. They come with a lifetime warranty. Break a tool, they'll replace it, and you can get a 10% discount using the code below, and they've been supporting us for well over a year. We must start with what has happened today. What we know about the shooting what we know about the shooting that took place in Minneapolis is that right now there are 2 dead, ages 8 and 10, 17 injured, including young children and elderly staff. And what is most shocking about this attack is not simply that it exists within what looks like a pattern starting to develop, but the alleged shooter posted a manifesto on YouTube that, as far as I understand, was 20 minutes long and included a more than one medium of communicating what his intents were, whether it was overt statements, things written on his equipment, or plans that were illustrated in how he was going to conduct the attack. And what makes this one so politically charged is that the shooter, who's been identified, was trans. Or was born a male and is now had his name changed to a feminine name, and there is a connection between those two. But the tactical aspect of this is that the shooter, the alleged shooter, whatever, it's of course headlines are going to say that it has been identified, but the alleged shooter or the identified shooter reconnoitered the church. He actually took the time to look at the best tactical ways to approach it, to avoid detection, to get the maximum effect for his engagement, and he even was looking at times where he's going to have the potentially the greatest effect. One key example is that there's a drawing of an auditorium where mass would be held, and this shooting took place at a time where the entirety of the school was expected to be at mass, was to be expected to be in service or in a service. So he deliberately targets a religious institution, he deliberately targets it during a religious activity, and he deliberately plans how and when to approach it so as to avoid detection, get maximum lethality out of his actions. And this is this would lead immediately to public debate over whether or not this was a hate crime. And while I have to address this quickly because the language of the hate crime kind of mentality is in danger of becoming part of like a Hegelian dialectic, adjusting the Overton window as if it was some sort of normal conversation, when in fact the crime itself was hateful. We already have the material. We already have enough sufficient material to just say, well, it was evil. It doesn't need to be a hate crime as if it were to identify some sort of, it doesn't need to be a hate crime in the sense that we're not going to play this game where we appeal to these stupid category sensibilities where some get higher levels of badness happening to them because they fit a certain, let's say, group identity. Like we as Christians should not be surprised in any way, shape, or form that the person attacked the people, likely because they were Christians, but we shouldn't depend on a socio-political, pseudo justice-oriented hate crime categorization in order to assert that justice ought be done and that this exact thing was evil. We shouldn't fall into the trap of a hate crime. The action was a murder, it was deliberate, and the target was chosen because they were Christians. And this draws from an issue of regarding what is called the Noetic covenant. After the flood, God speaks directly to Noah, and he gives him a covenant. He gives him basically he speaks into reality, or at least into the reality of the earth, something that is true. And I believe he does it in the same way that he does so in creation, that by God speaking it, it becomes true, just as by God speaking the creation into existence, it becomes true. And he does that in the form of a covenant with Moses. And this covenant is important not only for the Christians, but for us who understand law or are concerned about law itself. And that is the idea of murder. And murder... this is where the illustration of murder begins in, or is strongly reinforced in the Old Testament. Murder is the deliberate intent to destroy a life, and that deliberate intent and action of destroying a life is itself a sin, not because it is an affront to the thing destroyed, that is part of it, but particularly because it is an affront to God. The actions of the murderer, of this morning's murderer, are not a sin because they were taken against the Catholic institution. The sinfulness is sufficient, and that it was the desire to destroy life. And as the quote in Genesis 9:4-7 goes, God says to Noah, "You must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being." 6, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. And so the Noetic covenant illustrates that the thing that makes murder evil is that it is the destruction of an image bearer of God. And so many of man-made or human-centered humanistic religions have shifted that focus, even within the church, particularly in the sense of victimhood and hate crime and victim hoaxes and hate hoaxes, is that it has shifted the moral obligation and impetus of the sin of that which makes it evil away from it being an affront or a hatred for the image of God, which is man, a hatred for God's image created in man, particularly focused on God, and it shifts it to the man and says that it was wrong because I was harmed, that the sin is a sin not against God and his created order and his moral holiness, but it is a sin because I am the victim. And this is an important distinction which we will continue to build as we talk about theological relevancy to situations of this type, specifically those that have to do with violence and murder. And in the case of this event, we are looking at, by their own writing in Screed, that the murderer intended to affront God by calling on him as false. And he attacked Christians specifically because they worship God. So now what should we expect from the media coming from this? There's going to be some things that many of us are probably prepared to see. One is that this will very likely be swept under the rug as soon as the undeniable evidence is sort of made available to the public, whether by intent or by accident, that the school shooter was trans. We have to protect certain identities because their misbehavior cannot be accepted as public knowledge. It has to be some sort of dark, evil idea kept behind doors. You will likely also hear that the motive has yet been undetermined, despite the manifesto and despite overt claims illustrated in the murderer's own. Calling it artwork is too generous. We'll also see that like I said earlier, we'll see that the news cycle is going to move on. There's going to be some new event, some new thing to catch our attention. Remember, the media's job is to catch your attention. It's not to convey truth. And this event will likely fall into a stack of similar events to be brought up mostly by right-wing media. We might, if we were to go look to the right sources, we might find examples of people potentially attempting to explain away the murder. We might see cases where the murderer himself is listed as one of the victims. He might be added to a category of victims that are all trans-identifying shooters that are somehow categorized, sometimes in awkward cases almost deified as saints. But what most likely we're going to see, and the things that we need to be careful of, is overt publication, commentary, and examples that are creating or fanning flames of derision. And the warning here is to beware of obvious calls to action that stink with that sort of it's a trap language. And as Christians, there's a verse and a command that's given to us, and that is, in your anger, do not sin. This is paired with what Jesus speaks about in the early chapters of Matthew, particularly Matthew 5, where he says, if any of you harbors hatred against your brother, it is as if you have committed murder. And this is where Christians are recognized that we are held to a high standard, not by, say, our accusers, but the high standard that we are held to is that by God. In other words, if we are going to, even though we may recognize that we bear conviction to, and we may, even though in our conviction we recognize that we have righteous anger against those who have destroyed the young, in this way, the innocent. Even though we may be looking at that, we know that we should not sin. And one place where we're warned against sinning is by Jesus in Matthew 5, saying, do not harbor malice against your brother, for it will be as if you were committing murder against him. And we know that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we find God speaking to Noah saying, as we were talking above, anyone who sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed, and so long and so forth, and that it is a sin to desire premeditated violence against another man. So with this context in line, this I'm going to draw a little bit from what I've seen in recent church activity, as well as, and recent is in like the last 100 years. And also the things that make a security team function well in our environment. Churches may be tempted, as a reaction to what they're observing, whether through the media or even in more closer proximity to today's events, they might be tempted to reach out and try to get an off-duty cop to sit in the service and protect, act as some form of security. And I'm going to warn against this. For a number of reasons. It's not meant to be an offense to cops, unless you're a fat and lazy cop who doesn't know what he's doing and is relying on ego to carry him through what semblance of a career you might have. If you're one of those, then you can be offended. But for the majority of police, this isn't an attack on your skills, and this isn't an attack on your capabilities of observation and even your utility as a law enforcement officer. Rather, I think police officers are done a disservice if they are expected to engage in their profession of policing throughout the week, and yet when they come to church for rest and rehabilitation and a connection with sermons and the gospel and that which is right and true and good as brought about by the revelation of God given to us through the Bible, if they are expected to put that away and again resume the duties of being the police officer on deck, so to speak, I don't think that it's tactically sound. I think that I believe that my observation is that police officers who attend church in an off-duty fashion have their attention torn between the sermon and gaining something from that, and trying to survey the area for potential threats. And what that results is something has to give. Finally, and like I would not expect a religious leader to expect that as a casualty, that the police officer is expected to sort of forego his participation in the body as a Christian as well, just because of his profession. I also don't think it's theologically sound, because it excludes so much of the church from their own participation. Rather, I think the ideal church security team is something more resembling a men's group. What does it provide? It provides ownership for their environment, protection of their families, a sense of community, which is lacking for men in many churches, as well as accountability. If you are a member of a church or a common attendee, or you exist within some sort of leadership structure, and you constantly see men, particularly masculine men, visit your church and leave, what they're likely encountering is that they're observing the organization of your church as well as its congregation, and identifying that there's nobody that they will be able to respect in any meaningful way, or they will have no community there because essentially there's nobody like them, or there's no other strong men. They attend a church with some semblance of conviction, only to discover that they're being lectured by Karens and women about emotional sensitivities, or their base emotional approaches are being appealed to in some sort of generic way, and they realize that they're not going to get any red meat there. And I'm referring to red meat as talked about by Paul, not some sort of manosphere reference. And so this is illustrated in a book titled Why Men Hate Going to Church by David Murrow. It's a bit of an older book now, written more than 10 years ago. But what he identifies is that not only does the aesthetic, but the organization of a church being feminized, not to be confused with political feminism alone, but the feminization of churches results in the, eschewing of men's participation. And an ideal church security team solves and addresses both of these issues. One, men don't want to be a part of a church or beholden to a church that they have no participation in or no investment in. If the sole contribution that they can have is to open their wallet and shut their mouth, they're not going to be there very long. Some might sort of pass on their existence in this passive state, but I guarantee you their children will have nothing to do with it. And your church is as short-sighted, or not your church, but churches who are committed to a sort of distortion of the gospel that excludes men on the basis of convenience or tolerance, or whatever your political term of the day is going to suffer. And men who want to be invested in the well-being of their church, who want to be invested in the protection and defense of their church, of their community, if they are denied that because of, say, some quasi-political desire of some bastardization of a couple of verses uttered in the New Testament, well, then they're not. Then you're doing them a disservice. Rather, the counter is so much more effective. Instead of going out and trying to hire an off-duty cop to stand outside your door or sit inside your sermon and protect the flock, why doesn't the flock's men take up that mantle? Because they know the people who attend, they know the families who are there, they know and pay attention who comes in, and they are more able to serve those who are seeking the gospel, and they are more able to serve the gospel itself when they are invested in the church. And one way they can be invested in the church is the simplest form of security, which is when somebody new attends, they identify them and they invite them, or they approach it. That they, in that sense, allow people to be seen. But a security team then is invested in its own congregation, in its own community, will then be incentivized to consider what threats they have and what are the moral and theological obligations that they are beholden to. They ought, at least. And then there are certainly going to be cases where this doesn't happen. But instead of some sort of formalized black nylon wearing, polo tie standing out, obvious earpiece, generic sort of easy to sidestep video game character version of a security team, you might want to consider that the men of your church are already there, and they're most likely hungry for a way to participate in a way that's different than, say, the worship team alone or the worship team at all. And they want to look after their children and concern themselves with the well-being of the congregation. Now, if your church decides to pursue down a path of building some form of a security apparatus or a security team, I do want to warn you of some resistance that you may encounter, particularly that of writers like Barbara F. Walters, who in her book, How Civil Wars Start, she addresses this idea of right-wing violence and right-wing extremism rather loosely. I know that she admits in the beginning of the book that it's not intended to be an academic work. However, it does create a particular problem, because not only does the book itself function in sort of a Mott and Bailey, where she can say that the book is not, say, academic in its rigor, but then include statements that could be interpreted not only very loosely or more nefariously in a specific way without being held accountable for that specificity. The people who are the most alarmed about dog whistles might be the ones doing the dog whistling. And what she addresses in her book, How Civil Wars Start, and one of the things that can be pulled from one of the chapters is that all that is required for a person to be considered a sort of right-wing extremist, or in this case, a partisan of some sorts, or a participant or ignition of a civil war, is that they attend church and own a gun. That's it. It's not some sort of public rhetoric. It's not some sort of violent outburst. It's not some sort of specific iconography. It's you own a gun and you attend a church. If you attend a church, you're part of a religious community. If you own a gun, you have capability. And if you were to twist this even further in a dark distortion of law enforcement's approach to violence, is that you have the intent as illustrated by participating in a church, and you have the capability as demonstrated by owning a firearm. And so what does this mean? What is your response? Well, one, acknowledge that according to these types of accusers, you're already damned. They're not going to reasonably consider whether their standard is even worthy of consideration. Rather, they as an accuser most likely do not bear the morals of those they're accusing of being right-wing. They're accusing someone of right-wing extremism, even though they don't believe in even in the standards by which they're making the accusation. It's an accusation out of utility, possibly within the involvement of a power grab, or even just social power malice. And next, it's also an example of asymmetrical warfare on the cultural level. Now, asymmetrical warfare is a term, especially in political discourse, that gets very muddy very quickly. Whether you're in the boardroom of a bunch of generals trying to sound smart, or some sort of general officer, or you're hearing it in the political discourse, let me illustrate on how asymmetrical warfare in this case is functioning. Asymmetrical warfare is oftentimes defined by either sort of the layout of those involved or by the intent of those involved. A simple form of asymmetrical warfare is when you have an army who wears uniforms, carries issued equipment, is in conflict with a group or an somewhat ambiguous group that doesn't wear uniforms, doesn't use standard equipment, doesn't follow orders, doesn't engage in the Geneva Convention. A perhaps more useful way of identifying asymmetrical warfare is to look at the intent of those involved. On the one hand, you might have an army which is trying to achieve what would be a military victory. They're trying to win a battle, complete a raid, engage in some sort of decisive battle in the history of the West. They might want to win a gunfight, or so to speak, but their opponent is not interested in winning a fight are winning a military victory, but a political one. And this can happen on, say, the level of nations, where a nation state is is engaged against an insurgency. The insurgency is not trying to defeat the army of the nation state, but they're trying to subvert the population, perhaps inciting rebellion. This can come from, or if you want to read a book on it, perhaps a seminal or foundational book on this subject, go to none other than The War of the Flea by Robert Tabor. But another form of asymmetrical warfare that we're starting to see in our day and age is this sort of individual level, or smaller, what you might also consider small unit tactics. And this is where we identify an important distinction, where we need to make sure that we determine whether something is a strategic objective or a tactical objective. And that is a distinction that is oftentimes muddied in language, but let's be clear here. The difference between, say, the targeting of a church, what we would consider a strategic objective or a strategic goal, as opposed to a tactical one, is that a strategic goal is trying to shut down or destroy the institution as a whole. A strategic goal would be to cause a church to shut down, or to gain control over the mind, the body of that church. So a strategic goal might be to put my ideologues, fill your board with my ideologues. And yet a tactical goal would be to the goals and methods I get to, or the goals and strategy, or not goals and strategies, but a tactical objective or a tactical one would be to defeat opposition to, by say, we need tolerance. So it is a tactic to appeal to tolerance, but it is a strategy to use the board to control a church. In this case, let's say in the nation state, a tactical goal would be to win a battle, but a strategic goal would be to destroy an opposing country by winning the war. A strategic goal is to shut down a church or churches in general in an area, whereas a tactical goal is to attack a specific church in order to injure, kill, or destroy the church and its congregation. And this is an important distinction that that we as Christians need to understand, especially when it comes to these things about attacking churches. For example, we want to be careful not to look at what is a very clear tactical goal and from that extrapolate upwards into a strategic goal, because what we're doing here is we're falling into a trap, and I'll get into that in a little bit more. I'll continue as we work in that direction. Now, in order to address the theology of defending the flock, I want to start with a story that many of us grew up with. And that story goes something like this. A man, his son, and a friend go out on a voyage on a boat. And when they reach the deep waters, they encounter a storm. In that storm, the boy and his friend are cast overboard, and the father is stuck with a decision. He has to choose between throwing the life raft or the life vest to either his son or his son's friend. And as the story goes, the father throws the life preserver to not his son, but his son's friend, which after they return to safety, the son's friend asks why he did this, because in the story, since he could only choose one, because he threw the life preserver to his son's friend, it means that his son drowns. So when asked about this later, the father conveys to the friend of his son and says, I know that my son is a believer and I will see him again in heaven. And as the story goes, the son's friend is so touched by this that he also becomes a Christian, and this is sort of the happy ending of the tragedy of this story. And while this story, I think, is pleasant to read and pleasant to hear, in that it's a story of sacrifice and commitment to something greater than one's own well-being and their family. Certainly, if the father was an evolutionist, he would clearly just throw the life preserver to his son because he needs to preserve his genes, so to speak. Sydney Sweeney reference, way too late. Don't get at me on this one. So the story in this story doesn't necessarily convey a moral, so to speak, but it sort of illustrates how a man might show loyalty to God instead of loyalty to like faith, and have some sort of like long-term vision involved. While he tragically loses his son, he knows and he's secure in his faith that he will see his son in heaven later. And where I think this story goes amiss and where it goes wrong is that for many of us who grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, this kind of story was used to almost define theology. It was almost used to define how we ought approach the world, as if we're okay with generic martyrdom for no other reason than maybe the father shouldn't have gone out into the storm to begin with. But it also is oftentimes paired with an equally destitute form of theology, which relies on kind of quick, dishonest uses of certain verses, like turn the other cheek, thou shalt not kill, which thou shalt not murder. And these little bits of emotionally satisfying, which is weird because they almost always appeal to the vanity of both the speaker and the receiver, is a type of theology that has invaded the church for quite some time. It's my experience of the 1990s and the early 2000s, despite launching bangers in the Christian rock genre, it also led to this time of appeasement. This appeasement of, say, the seeker service, and that all of the organization and duties and development of the church was thrown and shifted dramatically, not to serve the congregation and build them up and teach them and grow in their wisdom and knowledge of the scripture, but rather to try to hope that the random person who attends the service is well, at least not confused by what they read, or worse, the gospel is sanitized to avoid offending any random passerby who might hear it. And this, of course, is going to be contrasted by those who brashly say rude and uncaring things under the guise of hiding behind the gospel. But that is another red herring for another time that serves no valuable input in what we're talking about. When many of these verses that are taken out of context, when looked at within the context within they are written and who is speaking them, and looking at the parsing of the Greek or the Hebrew that is written, we start to see that the colloquial, politically charged, generic garbage definition and use case of, say, turn the other cheek, doesn't mean what the accuser is saying it means. Rather, that Jesus is condemning the idea of a blood feud. And the issue that we see here, especially in a blood feud, is that it itself offends multiple elements of the Old Testament. In Romans 12:19, Paul talks about how God says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." And when you look at it this way, and when we look at it from a biblical view, a whole biblical view, we recognize that this idea of sort of passive Christianity is oftentimes portrayed as sort of a pseudo-martyrdom, but it's not. It's cowardice. It's masturbating somebody's self-fulfilling prophecy of how holy they are because they're willing to die for the cause. But in reality, what they're doing is they're choosing cowardice up until the point where they probably call the cops, and they claim victimhood now that they've achieved holy liberal American victimhood status. And so theologically, I believe, and I think if we look at the summary of the Old Testament and how the people are expected to look out for one another, participate in their communities, look after the well-being of their tribe, that leaders are not just expected to lay down and take it, so to speak, that they have a duty to the well-being and leadership of their communities, that under good leaders, the people prosper, and under evil leaders, they suffer. And if we are to look at recognizing that there are those who are attempting to attack the flock, that are attempting to attack the congregation, that we recognize that being passive is not the same thing as martyrdom, especially when that pacifism is weak. I think there's a strong distinction between strong pacifism and weak pacifism, where strong pacifism individually accepts all the consequences that one might face by choosing to abstain from force, even if that includes their own death or worse, torture, and perhaps, words that we're not going to say on YouTube, but you can figure it out. However, I think that becomes extremely destructive and even masturbatory, sinful, when someone's choice to engage in said pseudo-pacifism is also carried around in a sense of pride. And in this second case, this weak pacifism, there's this pathetic example of weak-minded, weak-hearted, weak-willed pseudo-theology that always is attached with some sort of superiority complex about how good a person must be, because I don't want to perpetuate the cycle of violence, which should be translated to I'm lazy, I'm immoral, and I'll call the cops as soon as I feel uncomfortable. And it's an exporting of one's individual responsibility. Husbands, fathers are expected, if not commanded, to look after the well-being of their family. They're expected to look after the well-being of others. And the egalitarianistic pseudo multiculturalism of the West that we live in today takes this and it distorts it and says, you have a greater duty to look after somebody who you have no affiliation to. You have a greater duty to look after somebody who even hates you for who you are, because we are supposed to pray for those who persecute us. Again, taken out of context, read it in Proverbs. So we are expected to, though, appeal to the sensibilities of those who overtly state that they hate us, while simultaneously putting our children up for slaughter as if it were some form of holiness on our own account. And rather, the theology that I am arguing, what I'm saying is that whether you consider the book of Romans, that God did not place people with the sword out of arbitrary means, or that husbands are not supposed to look after their fathers, husbands are not supposed to look after the well-being of their household. If you look at how in the Old Testament, mockers and fools are those who distort the truth in order to serve their own means, I think that we can find within some honest intellectual approach that churches, especially churches with a congregation with children involved, have a duty to the health and well-being of that congregation. What does this look like? There's an order of duties that we have. First, a duty to our family and then our congregation and to those around us, that we have a tighter duty to our neighbor than we do, say, a starving child in Africa. And it's not that we can't do good across the globe, but that we cannot seek after the spreading of the gospel. It's that we are lying to ourselves if we are forsaking in a fake martyrdom status our responsibility to our own congregation. And what is perhaps worst and most devious about this subject is that enemies of the church, spiritual and otherwise, seem to know that this is a source of consternation amongst churches. They appear at least to know that many churches have adopted a mentality of weak, therefore sinful, fake pacifism in order to inflate their sense of self-worth And that creates an avenue of approach by which they can be accused of doing the exact thing that they have postured their self-serving ideology to defend against. It's that it seems like both spiritual and physical enemies of the church have identified that they can appeal to the sensibilities of the church that the attacker doesn't even hold in order to further engage in damaging activity against the person. They can cause more injury, more moral compromise amongst the church. And this could be illustrated by, the shooter making affrontations to God. This can be ways where people will say that, well, the church is not tolerant enough of the wicked, even though they won't use the word wicked, that the church is not tolerant enough, or because they held to some moral standard, those who didn't agree with the standard were then thus, shunned into the corner, and you see how this creates a victim. This is Marxist. It's extremely simple to understand. If the justification for the bad behavior is that they were not treated properly, then you're looking at somebody who's saying, well, because something bad happened to me, I can do something bad to somebody else. You're back into, oh wait, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. And ironically, if you're tracking, and comically, if you're paying attention to where I started on this one and where we're at now, the very same people who level Jesus's words against believers by saying, Jesus said, turn the other cheek, are they themselves committed to the very thing that Jesus was speaking against? And that is that they believe in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and their self-described holiness via victimhood is an infinite source of justification to engage in any form of violence against you that they deem fit. So stop being a fool and expecting those who intend to kill you for your belief to then appeal to a reason and a morality that they don't even hold. They have rejected the gospel, but like a twisted serpent, they throw it back at the church in order to attempt to neutralize its defenses so that they may inject poison, both physical and theological, into the environment. So what is a strategy? Looking at what this shooter did today, what is a strategy, and not even a strategy, actually more specific, going back to my language, a tactic that church security groups can engage in order to prevent and bolster their defenses against this activity. The key element that needs to be identified about what today's school shooting did is that they reconnoitered the environment. They built a plan based on avenues of approach. They understood their area of operations, their AO. They engaged in understanding the timing, the schedule, the pattern of life of the church, and they probed it. They very likely went at some point to this location to begin to understand its layout and how they could be most effective in their attempted murder, which they were successful in. They killed 2 kids. The person killed 2 kids. And what this might look like is that your church, your school, might get probed by somebody who fits this description. We're not going to engage in the lie that profiling doesn't happen. It's oftentimes rules for thee and not for me kind of phrasing. But rather, if you're church security team, or you're at your church and you identify somebody who fits all of the warning flags of the trans community or these trans kind of issues, that has never attended the church before, and they randomly show up, whether during a service or during a sermon, or or they randomly show up, the first responsibility of the men of the church, when they identify someone fitting the demeanor of the trans community, comes to a church or a Christian school, the first response should be identify them and isolate them. This prevents an immediate attack, and it deters future attempts. And this can be done in many artful ways, by identifying them, greeting, approaching, observing this should never be done out of malice. It should never be done in that format. But by identifying someone, them being seen, ironically, again, is one key deterrence against engaging in violence against that location. You are essentially showing that it is not a soft target, but a hard target. But the importance of isolation is also that they are not able to be successful in their reconnoiter of your location. In other words, they should be isolated, separated from the church as a whole, rather than invited in and expected to, just like kumbaya with everybody else, because that never works. Only after the individual is determined sufficiently to be of genuine interest, then their isolation can be relaxed. This isn't to say that if a trans person shows up at your church, you immediately call the police and you throw a 5-alarm fire. Rather, it's that the intent of isolation is to determine whether a person is there with this maybe a heart of genuine repentance. Maybe they look a certain way. Maybe there's something else going on. But rather, it's to prevent somebody from taking advantage of your fear of being, quote, called out for being transphobic or whatever it is. And they should be isolated so that they're not able to, say, get access to other targets. If a person were to walk into a building with a suicide vest on, regardless of ethnicity or persuasion, we wouldn't see like, hey, come to our nursery and hang out with our kids. And so if somebody is fitting this description, they're new, a face that's never been seen before, and they're specifically probing the environment, you need to isolate and identify them. This has a doubling effect too, because we need to be aware of activists who are trying to create a reaction. Going back to the idea of tactical versus strategic outcomes, a tactical outcome is that is oftentimes employed by activists in our day and age, is to provoke a reaction in order to use that reaction as fodder for their ideology, or say throw a bottle of water at a police officer, film what happens, the response by the police officer, and then only publish the response as if it was out of line. The solution to this, the tactical solution to this, is record them, identify who they are, show them that you know who they are, that you know and you understand the tactic, and you directly address them with, you're recording this to create a reaction, and so on and so forth. The objective of my action is your reaction is a form of asymmetrical warfare, going back to what we were talking about, where the objective of the insurgent is not to create, say, a military victory, a security victory over your church or over your community or over your country, but a political one, to try to turn others against the church. And so this is where we must be wise and shrewd and intelligent in how we approach these kinds of threats. The point to kind of tie this all the way back to the beginning, the tragedy of today's shooting has illustrated that there are people who exhibit similar repeating pattern traits, actions, intents that have the intent to cause harm to Christians, especially Christian institutions, and are willing to kill children to do so. And as we're starting to see in the pattern, they often try to reconnoiter, they try to recon various targets to see how weak they are, whether they're able to access, say, a school through a back door or to prevent being seen by the public or the street. We see that they have a potential of trying to reconnoiter a location, posing as, say, like, someone who's interested in being there or just, doing the thing. And they're appealing to sensibilities, claiming that, oh, well, if you don't accept me, then it's homophobia or transphobia or whatever the term is. They're willing to hide behind culturally charged terms in order to defend their intentions, in order to attack and kill. Again, this isn't an even playing field. They're willing to accuse somebody of, say, transphobia in order to gain access to their facilities and kill their people. It's not that complicated, bro. But what is important, and where the intent and the impetus, the drive of this episode is that I wanted to convey a series of things. I wanted to convey on how today's murder illustrated something about a pattern that involves reconnaissance on targets. Targets that are appeared as soft are more attractive. That we have things to expect from the media, whether it's denial, explication, or trying to explain it away, or also listing the killer as a victim. From here, I illustrated what I believed the ideal form of a church security team will look like and what it won't look like, and what you might expect of accusations from those if you choose to do so. Finally, for those who are in positions of leadership, there's a theological foundation for this. There's a theological foundation for men participating, as well as a practical one in the well-being of the church and their families. And finally, I wanted to leave you with a tool, a method for identifying or addressing potential probes that you need to identify and isolate. Record so there's a pattern, and isolate so that you can limit the amount of damage they may do. The less they're able to ascertain about your church's pattern of life, the less they're able to identify where the weakest targets are, the nursery, the children, the school, the less they're able to lash out in their malice against your institution. And the better off you are on multiple layers. Your men will be more participant, they'll be more happy, your families will grow, your community will be solid, and hopefully you will endure long under the blessing of God. This has been a long episode, another long episode for this week. We are standing in tragedy. I'm hoping that you find some peace in the Lord and in the gospel. But in all things, remember, we are not in a war against flesh and blood, but against the principalities of this dark world. Those who seek to do evil because they hate God, and you are the image bearer of God. So as one, go forth and conquer.